This is my 22nd video on my attempts to construct a small OO gauge layout. See part 1 for my reasons for doing this, and my lengthy series on my N gauge railway modelling for more interesting stuff with trains actually running, etc. Though there will be a little bit of running here. This part deals with my build from a ratio Clerestory coach kit, specifically an LMS ex-Midland Railway's non-corridor 48-foot lavatory composite. Before I even begin with the details of this kit build, I want to state my current position with respect to ratio kits. Succinctly, if you're thinking of buying a ratio kit, my recommendation is don't. I've bought and built many ratio kits myself, for rolling stock, for buildings, and for other items such as bridges and signals. I've built numerous ratio kits in both OO gauge and N gauge, and at this point I've made a firm decision never to buy a ratio kit again. I do have a couple more on hand, and I will probably get around to building those, but I'm not going to buy any more. Obviously I need to clarify why. Basically, it comes down to two main themes: poorly made, defective parts and unreasonable assembly requirements. When I think back of all the ratio kits I've built, there was only a single one that wasn't afflicted to some degree by one or both of these issues. That exception was the OO gauge concrete footbridge kit, which was a fairly straightforward and quite sensible build, and which had parts made to an acceptable standard. Every other ratio kit I have built has either had, due to poor kit design, assembly requirements that were almost impossible to accomplish properly, or has had poorly made parts with excessive warping, flash, etc. I do realize that some folks will have skills greater than mine, and what is almost impossible for me may be more feasible for them. But I've been building kits for 60 years now, and I think it's fair to say that I have reasonably decent physical skills and intelligence. So I also think that it's fair to say that if I find it almost impossible to assemble the parts as indicated in the instructions, then there's something wrong with the kit design. I mean, Lord save a beginner who tries to work on one of these things. Now, the specific kit featured in this video did have its good points. Some of the parts, especially the coach sides, were well modelled and well made. The kit was moderately complete. It didn't include any decals, but it did include wheels and couplings, for which kudos to ratio. Rolling stock kits that come without couplings irritate me. It's like selling a car and then saying, sorry, wheels aren't included. But ratio have included reasonably functional tension lock couplings in their rolling stock kit, such that I've built anyway. So that's a point in their favour. And this kit did not have any assembly requirements that I found impossible, although it did feature some assembly requirements that I felt were unreasonable and could have been avoided with better care and commitment from the manufacturer, and we'll see those as we go along through the build in detail. Where this kit did suffer significantly from the ratio curse was with respect to poorly made parts. There was a massive amount of flash, to the point where it was sometimes hard to tell what the actual intended shape of the part was, and some parts were very badly warped, making assembly extremely difficult. Anyway, I should get on to the actual build, which I felt was fairly successful. This is the kit in question. I bought it as new, but it may have been made some time ago. I'm not sure if this style of packaging is still in use. I would dispute some of the printed claims on the packaging, most especially the easy to assemble. Not impossible to assemble would be more honest. Here are all of the parts after unpacking. One tan sprue for the coach sides, one black sprue with roof parts, one black sprue with floor and chassis parts, one black sprue with partitions, two black sprues with parts for bogies and couplings, and 4 plastic axles with wheels. There was also a sheet of clear acetate for glazing, which is on top at centre here, but a bit difficult to see, I guess. The kit came with 2 papers, one illustrating in grayscale possible ways of finishing the coach, and one 2-sided sheet of instructions. The instructions were heavily verbal, but did include some useful illustrations. The instructions suggest assembling the coach floor first. Gas cylinders and vacuum cylinders are attached to the floor, and I've separated out the parts for this here. The vacuum cylinders came as two parts, the main cylinder and the end with handle, I guess you'd call that. I wasn't clear whether the ends were supposed to fit inside the cylinders or just over the ends of the cylinders. No illustration is provided to clarify this. There seemed to be rims inside the ends of the cylinders, and I assumed that the ends must be supposed to rest on these rims, sort of ledges just inside the end, so to fit inside the ends of the cylinders. As they came from the sprue, they definitely would not fit inside, so I ended up filing down the ends until they fitted inside the cylinders. The ends weren't even really circular at all as they came off the sprue, and considerable filing was required to get them to fit inside the cylinders. Both types of cylinders were then glued to the coach floor. There were holes for pins on the vacuum cylinders and ribs for the gas cylinders to sit on, so it was reasonably easy to fit these parts, although the fit of the gas cylinders on the ribs was a bit wonky. The parts shown at bottom here are the sole bars. As may be seen, there was some considerable flash on these. Some had actually already been removed before this picture. There were also many attachment gates. Just separating these parts from the sprue and cleaning them up ready for assembly was as much work as some entire kit builds I've done. The sole bars glue up against the ribs along the sides of the coach floor. Once the sole bars are in place, the end beams can be glued on. It's probably best to do this before the glue for the sole bars sets completely, as the end beams help to get the sole bars straight. Next, buffers and coupling hooks are glued to the end beams. The kit does provide buffers in two lengths, as longer buffers are used for brake coaches. Next, the instructions say to attach the bolsters for pivoting of the bogies. These fit fairly positively over ribs in the floor. The next part to be dealt with is the roof. Tiny parts for the gas lamps and torpedo ventilators need to be attached to the roof for each compartment. These parts come cast into gaps in the roof, as seen here. The roof does not come with attachment holes for these parts cast into it. There's just a line along the inside of the roof indicating the level of the parts, and you are instructed to drill the holes for the attachment of the parts yourself. This wasn't all that difficult, but I felt it was a bit derelict on Ratio's part. Most manufacturers, in my experience, manage to include the attachment holes into their castings rather than telling the assembler to make the holes themselves. Anyway, I drilled the 28 holes required with a pin vise. Here's the roof with the holes drilled, but with the lamp and ventilator parts not yet removed. Another problem is previewed here. The roof is clearly strongly curved, whilst it is actually required to be straight in order to attach to the coach sides. Here's a close-up showing the drilled holes and the lamp and ventilator parts. The lamps are on the right and the ventilators on the left. I cut out all of the lamp and ventilator parts, a bit tricky to do given how small they are. The kit does provide 16 of each, where only 14 are actually needed, so you could get away if you lost a couple. Gluing these parts in place is very tricky. The ventilators are not too bad, as they can be grasped by the shaft with tweezers and pushed into the holes that way. The lamps, however, are shaped such that it is essentially impossible to grasp them with tweezers. Their conical shape will just make them ping out of the tweezers and get lost. I resorted to the trick of picking up the lamps using a wet cotton bud Q-tip, to which the tiny parts will stick. But it's very tricky to actually fit them into the holes like this, and they have to be orientated correctly relative to the sides of the coach, as their bases are sloped. So this part of the assembly took considerable time and effort, and I'm afraid I got a certain amount of glue where I really didn't want it as a result of fiddling to try and get the tiny parts in place. Here's the obviously curved roof, now with all of the lamps and ventilators in place, and also with the upper part of the roof glued on. As suggested as a possible approach in the instructions, I painted and finished the coach sides whilst they were still on the sprue. First I spray painted the outer sides crimson, then I used press-fix decals for the markings. Here you can see the press-fix compartment class numbers and LMS lettering in place with the tissue not yet removed. Here's that same side after removal of the tissue from the press-fix decals, which I find very easily done. You just wet it and the tissue comes right off. And now the other side of the coach is decalled similarly. Next I tried to apply some lining to the coach sides. I actually went on a shopping expedition for this, as I didn't feel that I could do a decent job of brush painting the lining, and I didn't have a suitable pen on hand. I ended up buying a gold lining pen, which can be seen here propping up the back of the sprue. I certainly didn't do a perfect job of the lining, but I felt I could live with the results. I realized that I'd omitted running numbers when applying the decals, so I added these after the lining dried. I couldn't find reliable information on the numbering of these coaches in LMS service, so I just used a number a little higher than one of my Hornby Clerestory coaches. Once all of the lining and decals had had some time to fully dry, I sprayed a coat of transparent matte fixative over the coach sides, and I also spray painted the entire roof matte grey. I cut the strip of clear acetate provided with the kit in half along its length, and then trimmed the halves to fit inside the coach sides and glued them in place. Now the sides were finally taken off their sprue, and the first side was glued to the coach floor, along with the coach ends. It appeared that the ends needed to fit inside the sides, up against ribs at the ends of the sides. The ends ensure that the side is properly mounted vertically, so it's best to do them all together. Now the second side can be glued in place. Next, partitions are glued in place between each of the compartments. There are no specific ribs or markings to position these, so they just need to be eyeballed to the mid-positions. I had spray painted these brown earlier. I cut pieces of white paper and glued them over the centre windows, since these would be for the lavatory, which, since this was a non-corridor coach, would only have been accessible from the first-class compartments on either side. Here I've finished gluing all of the partitions in place. The kit provides 8 partitions, but it seemed to me that only 7 were needed. Gluing the roof on was extremely difficult, as the roof was strongly curved, whilst the tops of the sides were dead straight, so it was like trying to glue a banana to a straight edge. Even after holding the roof firmly in place for 10 minutes, it still popped right off in the middle as soon as I let go. So I ended up clamping the roof in place overnight using doubled rubber bands, which did manage to fix it in place, at least so far. The final stage of the assembly is the bogies. I had bought suitably sized 14mm metal wheels with the intention of using them for this coach, but I was unfortunately unable to do so, as the bogies were so wide that the metal axles just fell out. The plastic axles supplied with the kits were able to stay in place in the bogies, as they had longer protruding spikes on their ends. Here's the first bogie completely assembled with the wheels and coupling, and the coach with its rubber bands now removed. The bogies were very fiddly to assemble. It was necessary to glue the second side on, held in place by the 3 cross members, whilst trapping the pivot of the coupling plate. This was very hard to do, as the cross members really didn't create any kind of positive hold on the sides, so the whole thing tended to skew about constantly, and getting it to hold straight and set whilst keeping the pivot pins in place was quite a trick. Once the 2 sides are on the bogie and set, the end beams can be glued in place, and then the running boards, a bit fiddly in themselves, as they need to be attached just by their 4 small descending attachment bars. The instructions said to ensure that the coupling hooks moved freely. I had to do a lot of filing to get them to fit in place and move at all, and I really could not get them to move freely. Finally, the bogies are attached to the bolsters earlier glued to the coach floor. This is tricky in itself, as the pivot pins need to be glued into the centre holes in the bolsters, but this must be done without getting any glue onto the face of the bolsters, as otherwise the bogie pivots will get glued in place and won't turn. And here is the coach assembled, as best as I was able to do it. I did think of possibly painting the sides of the top part of the roof, but I haven't done this. It would perhaps have been better to do this before gluing that part in place, as now the lamps and ventilators are in the way. Honestly, I'm rather surprised that there appear to be no windows in the upper part of the roof. What's the point of having a clerestory roof if it doesn't emit any light? Anyway, there is the coach coupled up between a kit-built Midland compound loco and a Hornby clerestory brake coach. It's not great, but it's not awful. It is very light in weight. I had intended to add some weight inside before attaching the roof, but the problems with the roof fit distracted me and I completely forgot to do so. Now let's just see a little video of this coach running on the layout. So here we are. I've got the coaches hooked up behind a kit-built LMS ex-Midland compound, which is at least a period-appropriate loco for the coaches. It's a kit-built loco and it's not the best running loco, I'm afraid. In fact, I had to repair it to get it to run at all when I got it. I didn't build it, it was built from a kit by somebody else. It doesn't like going round bends much even now, especially left-hand bends, and it's not the world's best running loco. It's getting a bit stuck on the points there. But as I say, at least it's an appropriate loco. That's not getting stuck. I actually stopped it there on purpose. The coach behind the ratio coach that I just built is the one behind the loco, and the other coach is a Hornby clerestory coach, quite an old one. I don't remember quite when they were made, but it's not a recent build. It's quite a bit different, and it does, of course, have windows in its upper roof. And it's coming round again here. Here we go. I'll slow it down there. It's the Hornby coach is a brake. I've got like 4, I think. Well, currently 4, and I think I've got 2 or 3 more coming from eBay of the pre-built clerestory coaches. I've always rather liked them. But anyway, there's the ratio one. Just as a postscript, I note that the sprue for the coach partitions also provided parts for vacuum pipes and a lamp. Well, the lamp obviously would be used on the back of a brake coach. The vacuum pipes, well, of course this would all be vacuum fitted stock, but on the other hand, when it was running, the vacuum pipes would be connected, not folded up like this, so I'm not sure if there's much point putting folded up vacuum pipes on an intermediate coach, although a folded up vacuum pipe would be appropriate on the back of a brake coach. The instructions didn't make any mention of these parts at all. The other parts you've seen here are the long buffers to be used on the back of a brake coach. Anyway, I decided ultimately not to use these parts, though I will keep the lamp for possible use on a brake coach somewhere else. So that's it. The ratio clerestory coach, the composite clerestory coach, I actually have a couple more of these in different ratio clerestory coaches. I'm not sure that I'm exactly looking forward to building them, given how much work this build was, but at least I was reasonably satisfied with the final result.